All right, so let's unpack this story. I'm sure a lot of you remember this one, maybe even saw it in the nightly news. Back in '72, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a plane crash in the Andes. That turned into a 72-day fight for survival. You've given us the Morbid podcast episode, historical accounts, survival guides, so clearly you're looking for something more than just the headlines with this one.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about this is we hear about, miracle on the Hudson, but this is like taking survival to a whole other level. It makes us really examine not just the limits of human endurance, but the decisions that are made when you're facing impossible odds.
Yeah, and it really does hit home for a lot of us. I
Yeah.
mean, who doesn't remember where they were when they first heard about it? We're talking about a chartered flight
Hmm.
carrying a Uruguayan rugby team and their supporters to Chile. And think about it. Many of these young men, they had never even flown before. This trip was a huge deal.
Yeah, the irony is almost palpable. This was supposed to be like the highlight of their lives, and then delays, bad weather, a critical navigational error transformed it into a desperate fight for survival.
And that navigational error, is something worth looking at. Apparently, the pilots miscalculated their position uh, because of poor visibility. They relied on outdated charts, and they ended up flying right into the heart of the Andes, thinking that they were about to clear the mountains and descend into Chile. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and it is a, reminder of how even small errors can have such catastrophic consequences, especially in environments as unforgiving as the Andes. And the sources really depict this crash as just a scene of absolute chaos. I mean, the plane clips a mountain peak, it's tearing apart midair, passengers are being tossed around the fuselage.
I mean, the fact that anyone survived it all is a miracle in itself. Experts believe that the deep snow cushioned the impact to some degree. But still, they estimated the plane hit the mountain going over 200 miles an hour. It's unimaginable.
Right. And yet amidst the wreckage and the immediate aftermath, the survivors, their instinct to survive, it just kicks in.
You see this incredible resourcefulness right from the start. They're tending to the injured, using whatever they could find, seat cushions, luggage, to create these makeshift shelters.
And there's that poignant anecdote about the rugby players. Despite their own injuries and the shock of it all, they start chanting to distract the panicked passengers, which is really, I think, an early sign of their incredible teamwork and that spirit that really gets them through this.
It really shows how, in moments of crisis, that human connection and a sense of purpose
Right.
can become lifelines. But their hope was met with, a devastating blow. They hear on their radio that the search has been called off. Imagine hearing that, knowing that you're stranded miles from civilization, limited supplies, and the brutal Andean winter is coming.
Yeah. I mean, that must have been absolutely crushing. Just a stark reminder of the immense challenge that lay ahead of them. Their world shrank to the confines of this snowy mountainside. Their lives hanging in the balance. It's amazing how resourceful they were, especially in those first few days. Like they were melting snow for drinking water. Which, I mean, that in itself, it's like basic survival, but you have to know you can't just eat the snow.
Right, you can't just eat snow.
You'll get hypothermia. So they figured out ways to melt it using sunlight and metal surfaces from the wreckage.
Wow, yeah. Talk about making do with what you've got.
Exactly. And they rationed, they had very little food and they rationed it. They knew every little bit counted. But as the days turn into weeks, I mean, they're facing this horrifying reality, like the food's running out
Yeah.
and starvation's, it's a real threat.
And that brings us to the probably the most uh, controversial part of this whole story, their decision to consume the bodies of those who had died. And I think it's important to be sensitive here because these weren't strangers. These were their friends, their teammates, people they cared about.
Absolutely. And the sources really talk about the emotional and ethical struggle that they went through. Just try to put yourself in their shoes for a second. I mean, Nando Parado, one of the survivors, he said later, "I didn't have any doubts. This is the only way out."
Wow. Yeah. Those words are they're chilling, but they're profoundly human, aren't they?
Yeah, they were facing an impossible choice, and they made a pact, that if any of them died, their bodies would be used to sustain the others.
And even Roberto Canessa, he was the medical student. I mean, he understood logically why they had to do this, but
Right.
even he struggled with it, with just the thought of it.
It's such a complex situation, the human emotion and just the instinct to survive.
Right. But it's important to remember that this decision, as shocking as it is, it was just one part of their story. They were constantly battling the elements. They pushed themselves beyond exhaustion, faced setbacks that, I mean, honestly would have broken most people.
And then it's like the plane crash and the starvation weren't enough. Then they get hit by an avalanche.
Oh my gosh. Buried alive in the freezing cold. I mean, can you imagine the terror?
The weight of the snow, the darkness, just feeling completely helpless. It's a nightmare.
It is. And they were trapped for days. I mean, their shelter, that fuselage, could have become their tomb. And they lost 8 more people in that avalanche. Just heartbreaking after everything they had already been through.
It just shows how fragile their situation was. I mean, nature can be so unforgiving, but their spirit didn't break, even then.
I know, it's amazing. They dug themselves out from under tons of snow, cleared a new exit from the fuselage, and they kept going.
It's incredible, really. I mean, they knew they couldn't just sit there and wait to be rescued. They had to do something.
And that's what led them to send a group out to find help. 3 of the strongest: Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin. They volunteered.
Think about that decision for a minute. They didn't have any special equipment, no maps. They had a vague idea of where to go.
It was a huge risk, but they prepared as best they could. They sewed sleeping bags from cushions, and they built a sled out of luggage. They even used human skin to make socks to try to prevent frostbite.
It's grim, but it shows just how desperate their situation was. They were willing to do whatever it took.
And even then, even with all the horror, there were moments of hope. They found the plane's tail section, and there was more luggage there. Dry clothes, chocolate, even a ski kit.
Those little things, they must have felt like huge victories, Not just for the physical needs, but for their morale, too.
Definitely. But their journey was far from over. They were trekking through this, I mean, just incredibly difficult terrain. And Vizintin, he realized that he was slowing them down. So he decided to turn back so that Parado and Canessa would have a better chance.
Wow. What an incredible sacrifice to put the needs of the group above his own, even though it meant he might not make it out.
Yeah. And those last few days, they must have been just excruciating for those 2 guys. Exhaustion, altitude sickness, false hope, probably. It's hard to imagine how they kept going.
And then, after 10 days, they saw it. Smoke from a campfire across a river. But they were too weak to shout, so they wrote a note and attached it to a rock.
Can you imagine that? Throwing that rock with everything writing on it, just hoping someone would find it.
And they did. A local farmer, Sergio Catalan, he found it. He gave them food and went for help. And that's how they were rescued.
It's like, it really is a miracle. After 72 days. But it wasn't over for them, even then.
Right. They had to deal with the trauma, the media attention, and just processing everything that had happened.
They didn't want to tell everyone everything at first.
Yeah.
Especially about what they had to do to survive.
I can understand that. It must have been just so difficult to talk about.
But eventually they did share their story. And the public, they were surprisingly understanding.
People realized, I think, the impossible choice they had to make. That it was about survival, not anything else.
Right. It shows, that people can have empathy even when it's hard. But what's really amazing is that many of these guys, they went on to live really successful lives. Like Canessa, he became a pediatric cardiologist.
Wow.
Yeah. And Parado became a motivational speaker.
Yeah.
And they still get together every year to remember and to celebrate that they survived.
That's really powerful. This whole story, it's so much more than just a survival story, isn't it? It makes you think about human nature and what we're capable of.
Yeah, it really does. And for me, what I take away from it is that even in the darkest times, the human spirit, it's amazing. It can endure. And hope can win.